Good afternoon. It's great to be blinded by the light, so I can't see how many people are out there, but thank you for the organizers allowing me the opportunity to give you a bit about the story of the experience of Gladel. These are my disclosures, and perhaps the most important one is that I'm up here representing Gladel because my English is fairly good. Other people should probably be here. This story started in 1997 in July, under the mentorship of Donato Alarcón Segovia, Chancellor at the Instituto Nacional de la Nutrición, where we spent about 4 or 5 days, all the people that you can see in the picture, and obviously can't recognize, working hard developing this program. But before that, I should say that part of the reasons why this did exist was because a group in Argentina, mainly mentored by Bernardo Poncestele, by a cyber expert called Daniel Villalba, developed a database which we could all use, and which had a series of characteristics which we still think are great, which allowed for the import and export of data from and to other users, breaking a language barrier. All the items are coded, and then if you export them from your Spanish database, you can import them into your English-speaking database and read them in English. So this was the main database we used throughout Latin America in a way to guarantee the credibility of all the information recorded. So why did we succeed? First, I think it was the undeniable leadership of Donato Alarcón Segovia, a mentor to many of us as a figure. He was a privileged brain, both in basic science and clinical science, which is very difficult to attain. And when he said that we could do it, nobody doubted. Had it been somebody else, we probably would have doubted. Second was the amazing perseverance of Bernardo Poncestele. For those of you who don't know him, think twice if you want to engage in some type of work, and never give him your email. You'll have a woodpecker 24/7, 52 weeks, sort of tapping on your brain. And then the donkey work, which is what all of us did, loading all the data. Essentially what it was a multi-center and multinational cohort, inception cohort. Patients had to be less than 2 years from diagnosis when they were incorporated, and this occurred in 34 centers throughout 9 countries. And patients were added on until we reached a proportion of patients according to the population of each one of the countries. Just to show you that what we managed to do was to have 411 patients at 6 months, which surprised us more than anybody else, I think. And then eventually we had 1,214, and finally we finished with the 1,480. So the first paper was this, published in Medicine, and what it showed us and the rest, essentially that the age was similar, perhaps a higher female-male ratio, and what it did show, particularly us Argentines who think we're the Europeans of Latin America, were that more than half the population were in fact mestizo. And if you come to the session tomorrow, you'll see that even Caucasian Argentines have a pretty high penetration of Amerindian ancestry. So this was a pretty important message first. And so for the North Americans who term Hispanics anybody with a Spanish name, the 3 patients here could be called Ramirez. This is a mestizo. This is obviously from Caucasian European descent, and this is an African Latin American. So if they're called Ramirez, they would be classified as Hispanics, and obviously these are pretty heterogeneous. The educational level wasn't great. 77% of the patients had less than 12 years education, and if we use the Grafar socioeconomic status scale, about 2/3 of the patients were low or middle-low class. And right from the onset in that paper with the 1,214 patients, it was pretty obvious that Caucasians had a milder disease, and the mestizo patients had more severe disease, particularly renal, as the African Latin Americans. And a multivariate model allowed us to establish that being non-Caucasian was associated with renal disease, lymphopenia, and Hydroxylidae. And after that came several other papers, one which was very dear to Donato on familial aggregation, then one on male systemic lupus, and one on kids around the world. And lupus around the kids in the Gladel cohort. And in 2005 we had enough follow-up to start to establish mortality, and it was interesting to note the mortality was 8% then, but and this has to do with what was just spoken by Loreto. 40% of the 46% that died were due to lupus activity. So we appear to be doing well in controlling infection, but we still aren't too good in controlling lupus activity. And the mortality in the group was associated with less education, poor medical coverage, and shorter follow-up. This was a Kaplan-Meier curve which showed that at 5 years the survival rate was 94%, and at 7 years 91%. We are working on the 10-year follow-up now, and we'll see how it goes. Mortality was also associated with other issues. Males died a bit more than females, but this was not such significant. Poor people died more than not poor people, as is to be expected. Interestingly, the elderly died younger, just as other cohorts, the Lumina, for example, but the kids also did worse than the sort of middle-aged adults. Mestizos did worse than African, Latin American, and Caucasian. These are others, which are very few patients of Asian descent. And people who didn't have adequate medical coverage died more than the others. So over the years, it was pretty clear that we managed to establish, first, different phenotypic expressions. Whites are not the same in lupus as mestizos in African, Latin American, who have more severe disease. Again, activity, according to the SLE and the MEX SLE was greater in the African American and the mestizos. And damage we can't talk too much about. It was low initially, but this was a very early cohort, and we still haven't looked at the data for the 10-year follow-up. The fact of being, again, non-Caucasian was related to earlier disease onset, and these patients died younger, perhaps reflecting more severe disease. And we tried to detect predictors of renal disease. Being a mestizo had an odds ratio which was similar as being poor or having a low C3 and more than having anti-double-stranded DNA. So if you're a mestizo with a lupus in Latin America, that's a bit of bad news. A couple of words about this. I mean, you know, we all know that antimalarials are the baby aspirin of rheumatologists. They're good for everything now. And when we picked up the significant difference in survival between those who used and who didn't, it was before the papers by Ruiz-Irastorza mentioning that, and also from the Lumina cohort, and also some insinuation about this from the Hopkins cohort, that antimalarials were related to survival and to more severe disease. And unfortunately, as happens with us, we only managed to write it up in 2010. But essentially, the news here is, and I think as rheumatologists owe the medical community to establish what dose and what duration of treatment with antimalarials is that good to protect the patients. We don't know if it's 400 milligrams a day over ages, if 2 times a week, as many of our patients are taking, is good enough for this thing. So I think we have to work on that. But this paper was important in determining that at least 2 years were needed to mark a difference between users and non-users. And a more recent paper showed that confirmed renal disease was worse than mestizos, and that antimalarials were protective to renal disease. A word about treatment and access to treatment. This is the treatment of the patients in the 2004 paper. Perhaps more steroids than was mentioned in a couple of lectures during the initial stages of this meeting and the academy. But don't forget that steroids are pretty accessible to most of our countries. Antimalarials, about 3/4 of patients, and please note that it was more chloroquine than hydroxy. I think that's another thing we owe ourselves. Chloroquine is a lot cheaper, and I'm sure that the excess toxicity is related to the higher doses we used to use for malaria, not for lupus. So I think that furthers more research. Immunosuppressive agents, etc., are more or less similar. So we've noticed that people who have less access to care do worse. And I just wrote this. This is a summary of a paper by Gulliford describing what is access to care. I wrote this summary because it's like a little poem that never will take place. Providing the right service at the right time and at the right place. It sounds great. We all know that will probably never happen. So I think that what we have to do is put into practice, rather than say, as we have done in RA for the last decade, including Latin America, to increase the public awareness of lupus, training GPs in early detection, access to expert treatment centers, and access to medication, etc., etc. And that line of thought, we recently published a paper, several of us here, members of GLADEL as well as GLADAR, a paper on current treatment of rheumatoid in Latin America. And this summary, I think, is probably applicable to lupus. We all agree that it's important to diagnose early, treat early with conventional drugs, alone or in combination, aim at remission or low disease activity, and this is the talk that will follow from Professor van Vollenhoven, and at biologics, this is regarding RA. But since we are going to talk about biologics, in that paper we also noted that the cost of biologics, at least in parts of Latin America, definitely in Argentina, are the same or higher than that in Europe and the United States or Canada. And this in countries with an average salary which is about a fifth of that of those countries. So there is no way that system will be able to sustain for many years. And having said that, the launching of Benlista in Argentina has been very important insofar as it is less than half the cost, the monthly cost of a biologic we have for RA. So I think this is the way, and I think personally that other drug companies should follow suit. So the feature of Gladel in the pipeline, there's a paper on CV manifestations. We're working on mortality and survival when we analyze the 10 or 12-year data now. There's a famous paper of SLE in the elderly, which Bernardo asked me to take out because it's my responsibility, but it's sleeping there until I get older. And in preparation, there's the 10-year follow-up of the cohort and a dream of trying to analyze costs of SLE in Latin America. And if you go through the posters here, there's 13 abstracts, out of which we hope some posters will come out, some papers will come out relating to different aspects of lupus in the Gladel cohort. So these are the centers that participated in the Gladel project. These are all the researchers that helped with this. And in coming to an end, this was Donato Alarcón Segovia's conclusion when he gave this talk at the last lupus meeting he went to, which was a lupus meeting in New York in 2004. And when he presented the data we had till then, he had said, and he said it with pride because he emailed all of us after that it is proven feasible to conduct a prospective multinational SLE cohort with continued incorporation of patients throughout over 7 years. What isn't on the slide is without any money. So what we have managed to do is produce a very large prospective inception cohort, which is multinational, multi-ethnic population with differences we have been able to show, heterogeneous and severe disease. And there is no doubt from the data that I showed you and from what we're seeing throughout the world and we've heard in the past few days that we still need to do better. I'm sure that if Donato Alarcón Segovia were still alive, he was particularly proud of his mestizo heritage, which some of us can't boast of. He would be very proud of this, and he would probably be here instead of me, definitely. And this is the group that convened in Lima in 2006 as a Gladel Executive Committee responsible for organizing this meeting. Thank you very much.